John Kennedy called a thug by Maxine Waters. Seconds later, he makes her regret it. The chamber of the House Oversight Committee was a cavernous space, its high ceilings and polished wood paneling lending an air of solemnity that belied the electric tension crackling through the room. Rows of lawmakers sat behind long desks, their aides whispering and passing notes, while journalists lined the walls, cameras trained on the witness table, where Thupper Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana sat, his posture relaxed, but his eyes sharp. The hearing was meant to be a routine affair, a discussion of a proposed bill to crack down on government corruption, but the atmosphere felt anything but ordinary. It was as if the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. Kennedy, known for his folksy charm and incisive wit, had volunteered to testify in support of the legislation, a move that had raised eyebrows among his colleagues. Why would a senator, especially one with Kennedy's reputation for avoiding the spotlight on contentious issues, step into the lion's den of a House committee dominated by political adversaries? The answer, it seemed, was about to unfold. At the front of the room, Representative Maxine Waters, a seasoned Democrat with decades in Congress, presided over the proceedings with an air of command. Her presence was formidable, her reputation as a fierce advocate for her constituents matched only by her sharp tongue and unyielding demeanor. As the chairman banged the gavel to call the hearing to order, Waters leaned forward, her gaze fixed on Kennedy. The room fell silent. The only sound the faint hum of the cameras and the occasional rustle of papers. The questioning began with the usual formalities, procedural inquiries, clarifications about the bill's language, but there was an undercurrent of hostility in Waters's tone. Her questions were pointed, her words clipped as if she were probing for a weakness. Kennedy answered each one with measured calm, his Louisiana drawl softening the edges of his responses, but his eyes never left hers. The exchange was civil, but it was clear that something was brewing beneath the surface. Then, in a moment that would sear itself into the memory of everyone present, Waters leaned into her microphone, a smirk curling the corner of her mouth. "With all due respect, Senator Kennedy," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "you don't belong here. You're nothing but a thug in a suit." The words landed like a thunderclap. Gasps rippled through the chamber. Aides froze mid-step, their faces a mix of shock and disbelief. Journalists scrambled to adjust their cameras, zooming in on Kennedy's face, waiting for his reaction. The insult hung in the air, a poisonous barb meant to humiliate, to reduce a United States senator to a caricature. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Every eye trained on Kennedy, expecting outrage, a raised voice, or perhaps a retreat into stunned silence. But Kennedy didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He simply looked at Waters, his expression unreadable. His hands folded calmly on the table before him. The silence stretched on heavy and suffocating for a full 5 seconds. It was the kind of silence that made people shift uncomfortably in their seats, the kind that signaled something monumental was about to happen. When Kennedy finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, and carried a weight that filled the room. "Ma'am," he began, his drawl deliberate, "I came here today to talk about a bill that could help clean up corruption in this government. I came to speak for folks who've been let down by the system, folks who deserve better than what they've been getting. You want to call me a thug? That's your choice, but let's talk about what's really going on." He paused, letting the words settle his eyes, never leaving Waters. The room was so quiet, you could hear the faint scratch of a journalist's pen. Kennedy reached for a folder on the table, his movements slow and deliberate, and opened it to reveal a single sheet of paper. "This here," he said, Holding it up for the cameras is a letter from a woman named Carla Jones, a single mother of 3 who lives in your district, Congresswoman. She wrote to your office 6 times last year, begging for help with a landlord who refused to fix a leaking roof. Her kids were sleeping under buckets to catch the water. You know what she got back? Nothing. Not a call, not a letter, not a single word. The chamber erupted in murmurs. A few lawmakers exchanged glances, their expressions uneasy. Waters shifted in her seat, her smirk gone, replaced by a flicker of discomfort. Kennedy didn't raise his voice, didn't gesture wildly, but every word he spoke seemed to carry the weight of a gavel. "Now, I don't know what you think a thug is, ma'am," he continued, "but I reckon it ain't someone who's trying to shine a light on folks like Carla, who have been ignored by the very people they elected to serve them. You've been in Congress for over 30 years, Congresswoman. Your district's got some of the highest poverty rates in the country. Folks are living in homes with no heat, no clean water, and you're sitting here calling me names. I think we need to talk about who's really letting down the people." The murmurs grew louder, a low hum of shock and agreement. A young aide behind Waters dropped a stack of papers, the sound echoing in the tense silence that followed Kennedy's words. Waters leaned forward, her hands gripping the edge of the desk, and tried to interrupt. "Senator, this is a hearing, not a soapbox," she said, her voice sharp, but less confident than before. The chairman raised a hand, his expression neutral but firm. "Let him speak," he said. Kennedy nodded a small gesture of acknowledgement and continued. "I'm not here to grandstand, Congresswoman. I'm here because I believe in accountability. And I believe the folks in your district deserve to know why their calls go unanswered, why their schools are falling apart, why their neighborhoods are crumbling, while their representative sits in Washington pointing fingers at everyone but herself." He placed the letter from Carla Jones back in the folder and pulled out another document, this one thicker with charts and numbers. "This is a report from a community group in your district," he said, his voice steady. "It shows that over the past 5 years, millions of dollars in federal grants meant for housing repairs and job training never made it to the people who needed it. Instead, those funds went to organizations with ties to folks close to your office. Now, I ain't saying you broke the law, ma'am, but I am saying it don't look right. And when folks like Carla Jones are left with a leaking roof and no hope, it's our job to ask why." The room was buzzing now, journalists whispering furiously into their phones, aides scribbling notes, and lawmakers shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Waters' face was a mask of barely concealed frustration, her lips pressed into a thin line. She opened her mouth to respond, but Kennedy held up a hand, his gesture polite but firm. "I ain't done yet," he said, his tone still calm but carrying an edge of authority. "Let me tell you about a man named Marcus Tate. He's a father of 2 lives in South LA in your district. He lost his job during the pandemic and applied for one of those job training programs your office was supposed to oversee. He waited months for a response, only to find out the program was canceled because the funds were redirected. Where'd that money go, Congresswoman? Because it sure didn't go to Marcus, who's now working 2 jobs just to keep his kids fed." Kennedy's words were like a slow burning fire, each one building on the last, painting a picture of neglect and betrayal that was impossible to ignore. The cameras caught every moment, zooming in on Waters' face as she struggled to maintain her composure. A young woman in the gallery, seated near the back, wiped her eyes with a tissue, her hands trembling. She was from Waters' district, one of the many who had come to Washington hoping to be heard. Kennedy didn't see her, but he didn't need to. His words were for her, for Carla, for Marcus, for every person who had been promised help and received only silence. "See, ma'am," Kennedy said, his voice softening slightly, "I don't think I'm a thug. I think I'm just a man who's tired of seeing good people get left behind. And I think the folks in your district are tired too. They're tired of promises that don't mean nothing, tired of leaders who care more about their own power than the people they serve. You called me a thug, but I'm not the one turning my back on the folks who need me. I'm here speaking for them because someone's got to." The chamber was silent again, the weight of Kennedy's words settling over the room like a heavy fog. Waters tried to regain control, leaning into her microphone with a forced smile. "Senator, this is political theater," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "You're using these stories to make me look bad, but you don't know the first thing about my district." Kennedy didn't blink. He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers. "Then tell me, Congresswoman," he said, his voice low and steady. "Tell me why Carla Jones never got a call back. Tell me why Marcus Tate's kids are going to bed hungry. Tell me why the people in your district are still waiting for the help you promised them decades ago." Waters opened her mouth, but no words came out. The room was stunned, the silence so profound it seemed to echo. A journalist in the back whispered to a colleague, "He's got her!" Another reporter's phone buzzed with a breaking news alert, the headline already forming. "Kennedy confronts Waters in explosive hearing." The chairman cleared his throat, sensing the need to regain order. "We'll take a brief recess," he said, banging the gavel. The room erupted into chaos as lawmakers and aides stood whispering furiously while journalists rushed to file their stories. Kennedy remained seated, his hands still folded, his expression calm but resolute. He knew the hearing was far from over, and he was ready for what came next. As the lawmakers filed out, the gallery buzzed with hushed conversations. The young woman who had been crying approached a friend, her voice trembling. "I've never seen anyone stand up for us like that," she said. Outside the chamber, clips of Kennedy's response were already spreading across social media, shared by people who had never paid attention to a congressional hearing before. On YouTube, a live stream of the hearing saw its view count skyrocket, with comments flooding in. Kennedy just spoke for every forgotten American. Waters didn't see that coming. This is why we need leaders who care. In a small community center in South LA, a group of residents gathered around a laptop, watching the clip in silence. When Kennedy mentioned Carla Jones, a woman in the group gasped. "That's my neighbor," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. Back in the chamber, Kennedy sat alone at the witness table, flipping through the folder of documents he had brought. His hands were steady, but his heart was heavy. He hadn't come to Washington to humiliate anyone, but he couldn't stay silent while people suffered. He thought of the stories he had read, the letters from constituents who had been ignored, the families who had lost hope. He knew this was only the beginning, that the truth he had started to uncover would demand more than a single hearing. But for now, he had done what he came to do. He had given a voice to the voiceless, and he had made Maxine Waters regret her words not with anger, but with the undeniable power of the truth. The recess was nearly over, and the chamber was beginning to fill again. Kennedy closed his folder and took a deep breath, preparing himself for the next round. He didn't know what Waters would say when the hearing resumed, but he was ready. He had come to speak for the people, and he would not be silenced. As the chairman called the room back to order, the cameras zoomed in once more, capturing the moment that would define this day in Washington. John Kennedy, the man called a thug, was about to show the world what it meant to stand for something greater than himself. The chamber hummed with restless energy as the recess ended and lawmakers trickled back to their seats, their faces a mix of curiosity and unease. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind that settles over a room when everyone knows something seismic is unfolding. Journalists, now doubled in number, crowded the walls, their cameras trained on the witness table where Senator John Kennedy sat, his expression as calm as it had been before the break. His hands rested on a stack of folders, each one meticulously organized, a silent promise of more revelations to come. Across from him, Representative Maxine Waters returned to her seat, her posture stiff, her eyes avoiding Kennedy's. The smirk she had worn earlier was gone, replaced by a guarded frown, as if she sensed the ground shifting beneath her. The chairman banged the gavel, calling the hearing back to order, and the room fell into a tense silence, every ear straining to catch what would happen next. Kennedy leaned forward, his Louisiana drawl cutting through the quiet like a blade. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," he said, his voice steady, but carrying a weight that commanded attention. "Before the recess, I shared a story about Carla Jones, a mother in Congresswoman Waters' district, who's been left to fend for herself. But Carla ain't alone. There are thousands of folks like her, and I reckon it's time we talk about why." He opened one of his folders, pulling out a thick report, its pages marked with yellow tabs. "This here's a public record, though it's been conveniently overlooked," he said, holding it up for the cameras. "It details how over $10 million in community development funds meant for folks in South LA ended up in the hands of organizations tied to people close to Congresswoman Waters' office. Not schools, not clinics, not families like Carla's. Organizations that on paper promise job training and housing, but deliver little more than empty workshops and fancy letterheads." The chamber buzzed with murmurs, a low ripple of shock spreading through the gallery. Waters' hands tightened on the desk, her knuckles whitening. Kennedy didn't pause, his voice measured but relentless. "Let me tell you about a place called Lincoln Elementary," he continued. "It's a school in Congresswoman Waters' district where kids are learning in classrooms with broken windows and no heat in the winter. The principal, Ms. Evelyn Carter, applied for a grant 3 years ago to fix the building and buy new books. That grant was part of a federal program your office oversees, ma'am. But the money never came. Instead, it went to a nonprofit run by a friend of your campaign manager. That nonprofit, it hosted one job fair in 2 years, while Lincoln's kids are still reading textbooks from the 90s. A gasp escaped the gallery where a group of teachers from South LA sat, their faces a mix of anger and grief. One of them, a middle-aged woman with graying hair, clutched a notebook, her eyes welling up. Kennedy's words weren't just accusations. They were a mirror held up to a reality these people had lived for years. Waters tried to interject, her voice sharp but unsteady. "Senator, you're cherry-picking stories to fit your narrative," she said, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "My office has fought tirelessly for my constituents." Kennedy tilted his head, his expression almost sympathetic. "Then why's Miss Carter still waiting, ma'am?" he asked. "Why's Lincoln Elementary falling apart? If you're fighting, who's winning?" The question hung in the air unanswered. The chairman raised a hand to quiet the growing whispers, but Kennedy was already moving on. He pulled out another document, this one a series of emails printed from a public records request. "These emails," he said, "show your office directing a housing repair fund to a company called Bright Futures, LLC. Sounds nice, don't it? Problem is, Bright Futures is owned by a cousin of one of your top aides. They got $3 million to fix homes in Watts. You know how many homes they fixed? 7. 7 homes while families are living with mold and leaking pipes." The room erupted in shocked murmurs, and a journalist's phone slipped from her hand, clattering to the floor. Waters' face was pale now, her lips pressed into a thin line. She opened her mouth to respond, But Kennedy held up a hand, his gesture polite but firm. "I ain't done, ma'am," he said. "The folks deserve to hear this." He turned to the gallery, his eyes scanning the faces of the people who had traveled from Waters District to be here. "I got a call last week from a man named Reverend Thomas Green," he said. "He runs a small church in Compton in your district. He's been trying to get funding for a youth center to keep kids off the streets. He wrote to your office 10 times over 2 years. Never got a response. But you know what he did hear? That a community grant went to a consulting firm tied to your family's business interests. That firm got paid to study youth programs. No center was built. No kids were helped. But that firm made a tidy profit." Kennedy's voice softened, but it carried a quiet fury. "Reverend Green ain't asking for a mansion, ma'am. He's asking for a chance to save his kids. Why didn't you answer him?" The gallery was no longer quiet. A man in the back, wearing a worn jacket, stood up, his hands trembling. "That's my pastor," he shouted, his voice cracking. The chairman banged the gavel, but the emotion in the room was uncontainable. Waters tried to regain control, her voice rising. "This is a smear campaign," she said, pointing at Kennedy. "You're twisting the truth to attack me." But her words lacked conviction, and the room could feel it. Kennedy shook his head, his expression almost sorrowful. "This ain't about you, Congresswoman," he said. "It's about the people you swore to serve. And they're tired of being twisted." Then came the moment no one expected. The chamber doors opened, and a woman stepped forward, escorted by an aide. She was in her 50s, her face lined with exhaustion, but her eyes burned with resolve. Kennedy nodded to her, his voice gentle. "This is Ms. Lorraine Hayes," he said. "She used to work in your office, Congresswoman. She's here to tell her story." The room fell silent, every eye on Lorraine as she approached a microphone set up near the witness table. Her hands shook as she spoke, but her voice was clear. "I worked for Representative Waters for 3 years," she said. "I saw how calls from constituents were ignored, how complaints about housing and schools were sent to a voicemail no one checked. I was told to prioritize donors, not people. I left because I couldn't live with it anymore." The chamber exploded in gasps and whispers. Journalists scribbled furiously, their cameras zooming in on Lorraine's face, then on Waters, who sat frozen, her hands gripping the desk. Lorraine continued, her voice breaking. "I believed in you, Congresswoman. I thought we were helping people. But we weren't. We were helping ourselves." She stepped back, tears streaming down her face, and the room was silent again, the weight of her words settling over everyone. Kennedy looked at Lorraine, his expression one of quiet respect. "Thank you, Ms. Hayes," he said. That took courage. Waters tried to respond, her voice trembling. "This is outrageous," she said. "This woman is lying, and you're exploiting her for your own agenda." But the accusation fell flat. The gallery was murmuring, the lawmakers were shifting uncomfortably, and even Waters's own aides looked uneasy. Kennedy didn't raise his voice, didn't gloat. He simply opened another folder. "These are signed statements from 3 other former staffers," he said. "They say the same thing Ms. Hayes did. They say your office stopped listening to the people a long time ago. Now, you can call them liars, ma'am, but the truth don't bend that easy." The hearing was spiraling out of Waters's control, and everyone could see it. Outside the chamber, the story was spreading like wildfire. Clips of Kennedy's speech and Lorraine's testimony were uploaded to social media, racking up millions of views. In South LA, a group of residents gathered in a church basement, watching the live stream on a borrowed projector. When Lorraine spoke, a woman in the crowd stood up, her voice shaking. "That's what happened to me," she said. I called her office about my son's school, and they never called back. The room filled with nods and quiet sobs, the pain of years of neglect spilling out. Back in the chamber, Kennedy leaned forward, his voice softer now, almost pleading. "Congresswoman, I don't enjoy this," he said. "I don't want to be here airing these truths. But when folks like Reverend Green and Ms. Hayes and all the people in your district are crying out for help, someone's got to speak for them. You had a chance to be their voice, ma'am. Why didn't you?" Waters didn't answer. Her eyes were glassy, her hands trembling slightly. The chairman cleared his throat, sensing the need to move on. "Senator, do you have anything further?" he asked. Kennedy nodded, closing his folder. "Just one thing," he said. "This ain't the end. The people deserve answers, and I reckon they're going to keep asking until they get 'em." The hearing adjourned for the day, but the story was far from over. As Kennedy gathered his papers, the gallery broke into quiet applause, not for him, but for the truth he had brought to light. Waters left the chamber quickly, her aides trailing behind their faces, grim. Outside journalists swarmed, shouting questions, but Kennedy didn't stop to answer. He walked through the Capitol halls, his steps steady, his heart heavy with the stories he carried. In the streets of South LA, churches and community centers were filling up not with anger, but with a new kind of resolve. The truth was out, and the people were ready to be heard. The House Oversight Committee chamber felt different as the hearing reconvened for its final session. The air was no longer charged with the raw tension of the first day. Instead, it carried a quiet heaviness, like the calm after a storm. The seats were packed with more spectators than before, their faces a mix of hope and apprehension. Journalists had set up additional cameras, their lenses trained on Senator John Kennedy, who sat at the witness table, his hands resting on a small black notebook, rather than the thick folders of documents that had defined the earlier sessions. Across from him, Representative Maxine Waters entered slowly, her shoulders slumped, her eyes fixed on the floor. The fire she had brought to the hearing's start was gone, replaced by a weary resignation. The chairman banged the gavel, and the room settled into an expectant silence, ready for the final chapter of a moment that had already reshaped the nation's conversation. Kennedy leaned into the microphone, his Louisiana drawl soft but clear. "Mr. Chairman, thank you for letting me finish what I came here to say." He began, his voice carrying a warmth that contrasted with the weight of the moment. "The last couple of days, we've talked about hard truths about folks in Congresswoman Waters' district who've been let down about systems that ain't working the way they should. But today, I don't want to just point fingers. I want to talk about what comes next. Because the folks watching this, the folks who've been hurt, they don't need more blame. They need hope." He paused, his eyes scanning the gallery where residents from South LA sat alongside teachers, pastors, and community leaders, their expressions a mix of exhaustion and determination. The cameras caught a young boy in the crowd, clutching a worn notebook, his eyes wide with awe as he watched Kennedy. "I've been thinking about a woman I met back in Louisiana." Kennedy continued, his voice steady, but tinged with emotion. "Her name's Miss Eleanor. 82 years old, lives in a small house outside Baton Rouge. She spent her life working as a school cook, raising 3 kids on her own. When I met her, she told me something I'll never forget. John, you don't need to be perfect to do right. You just need to care enough to try." That stuck with me, because that's what this hearing's about. Not tearing someone down, but caring enough to try for something better. He opened his notebook, revealing pages filled with handwritten notes, not legal documents or reports, but stories. These are letters from folks all over, not just in Congresswoman Waters' district, but from places like Shreveport, Chicago, Mobile. Folks who've been ignored, who've written to their leaders and gotten nothing back. They ain't asking for the moon, just a fair shake. The room was silent, every word landing with quiet force. Waters sat motionless, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her face unreadable. Kennedy's tone shifted, becoming more direct. "Congresswoman, I don't believe you set out to hurt anybody," he said, his eyes meeting hers for the first time that day. "I think you started with good intentions, like most folks do. But somewhere along the way, power got in the way. It's easy to forget the people when you're surrounded by folks telling you how important you are. But that's where we go wrong, ma'am. Power ain't a crown. It's a responsibility." The gallery murmured in agreement, a soft ripple of nods and whispers. A woman in the third row, a community organizer from Watts, dabbed her eyes with a tissue, her lips trembling. Kennedy leaned back, his voice softening again. "This ain't just about one district or one person," he said. "It's about all of us, every elected official, every citizen. We've got to hold each other accountable, not with anger, but with honesty. Because when we let leaders slide, when we let funds disappear, or promises get broken, it's folks like Miss Eleanor, like Carla Jones, like that young boy over there who pay the price." He gestured toward the boy in the gallery, who looked up startled, then smiled shyly. The cameras zoomed in, capturing the moment, and social media began to light up with the image, a symbol of the future Kennedy was fighting for. Then came the unexpected. Kennedy closed his notebook and looked directly at Waters, his voice almost a whisper. "Ma'am, I don't hold any hate in my heart for you," he said. "I believe you can still do right by your people even now. But it starts with listening, not to me, not to the cameras, but to the folks who've been knocking on your door for years. They're still waiting." The room gasped softly, the sincerity of his words cutting through the political divide. Waters blinked rapidly, her hands trembling slightly, but she didn't respond. The chairman cleared his throat, visibly moved. "Senator, do you have any final evidence to submit?" he asked. Kennedy nodded, pulling a single sheet of paper from his notebook. "This is a petition," he said, holding it up. "Signed by over 2,000 residents of Congresswoman Waters' district, asking for an independent review of how their community funds have been spent. I'm submitting it to the record, not to shame anyone, but to give those folks a voice." The gallery broke into quiet applause, the sound growing as more joined in, not a roar, but a steady, respectful acknowledgement. Waters' aides whispered among themselves, their faces tense, while lawmakers on both sides of the aisle exchanged glances, some nodding in approval. Kennedy continued, his voice firm but hopeful. "This petition ain't the end," he said. "It's a beginning. It's a call for all of us to do better, to make sure every dollar, every promise reaches the people it's meant for. And it's a reminder that the folks out there, the ones watching this, have power too. They can vote, they can speak, they can demand change. And we'd better listen." The hearing was drawing to a close, but Kennedy had one final story to share. "Let me tell you about a girl named Aisha," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "She's 13 lives in South LA. She wrote to me after the first day of this hearing, said she watched it on her school's computer. She told me about her mom, who works 2 jobs but can't afford a safe apartment. Aisha said, 'I want to believe things can get better, but I don't know if anyone cares.' Well, Aisha, I care. And I know there are millions of folks out there who care too. This hearing ain't just about what's broken, it's about what we can fix together." He paused, letting the words sink in, then looked out at the gallery. "To Aisha, to every kid watching, I say this, don't give up. Your voice matters. And when you speak, we'll listen." The room was silent, the weight of Kennedy's words settling over everyone. Waters remained still, her eyes glossy, her hands clenched. The chairman spoke, his voice thick with emotion. "Senator, you've given this committee a lot to think about," he said. "This hearing is adjourned." The gavel fell, and the chamber erupted in applause, not wild or triumphant, but deep and heartfelt, a recognition of a truth that had been spoken and a hope that had been kindled. Kennedy stood gathering his notebook and nodded to the gallery, his expression one of quiet resolve. As he stepped away from the table, the young boy from the crowd ran forward, holding out his notebook. Kennedy knelt down, signed it with a smile, and whispered something that made the boy beam. The moment was captured by every camera, a symbol of connection that would go viral within hours. Outside the chamber, the world was reacting. In South LA, churches and community centers were overflowing with residents not protesting, but organizing, planning town halls, drafting petitions, demanding accountability. A pastor in Compton played Kennedy's final speech on a loop, his congregation nodding in agreement. "He didn't just talk," the pastor said. "He showed us how to fight with truth." On social media, Aisha's letter was shared millions of times with hashtags like #ListenToAisha, trending across platforms. News outlets from CNN to local papers called the hearing a turning point, not for its drama, but for its humanity. Even Waters' allies were quiet, some issuing cautious statements about the need for transparency, while her office remained silent, the phones ringing unanswered. Back in the Capitol, Kennedy walked through the halls, his steps slow but steady. He passed a group of interns watching a replay of the hearing on a laptop, one of them whispering, "I didn't know politics could feel like this." Kennedy didn't stop to speak to the press, didn't bask in the attention. Instead, he returned to his office where a stack of letters from constituents awaited him. He opened one from a teacher in South LA who wrote, "Thank you for seeing us. We're ready to keep going." Kennedy smiled, a tired but genuine smile, and set the letter aside. He knew this wasn't the end, but a beginning, a call to action for every citizen to hold their leaders accountable, to demand truth, and to build a better future. The lesson of the hearing was clear. Truth and integrity are the foundation of a just society. Kennedy had shown that power without responsibility breeds neglect, but courage and honesty can spark change. He urged the audience to get involved. Vote, speak out, join community efforts, because every voice from Aisha's to Miss Eleanor's has the power to shape the world. As South LA began to rebuild with residents forming coalitions and demanding answers, Kennedy's words echoed, "Don't give up. Your voice matters." And in that moment, America felt a little more awake, a little more ready to listen.